Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Selby Nimrod, Assistant Curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, and it is my esteemed privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation with artist Ji Hye Kim and Dr. Maria Walsh, author of Art and Psychoanalysis. This virtual public program is held in conjunction with Cindy's first institutional solo exhibition, List Projects 22, Ji Hye Kim, that's currently installed in the List Center's Bacalar Gallery. While our physical spaces remain closed due to MIT's COVID protocols, we're happy to be able to share Cindy's work and her List Center exhibition with you through this program, as well as through photo documentation of the exhibition, interpretive materials, and a video interview with the artist, all of which are available on our website. Before I formally introduce Cindy and Maria, I'd like to extend the List Center's sincere thanks to those whose support and diligent efforts were instrumental in realizing Cindy's exhibition and this public program. We are grateful for the continued institutional support of MIT, the List Center Advisory Committee, and members of the List Center's Directors Circle, whose membership funds our exhibition program. Thanks also to the National Endowment of the Arts for their support of our List Projects exhibition series, the generosity of the lenders to the exhibition, Collection Majudia and Rahul Sabnani, the List Center team, of course, and especially Campus and Public Programs Manager Emily Garner and Public Program Intern Kelly Chen, who organized today's event, Nick of MIT AV for their technical support on this event, and also the live captioning for this event. Dr. Maria Walsh for her great insights into Cindy's work and for so generously making the time to join us across many time zones today. And of course, to Ji Hye Kim, with whom it has been my great pleasure to work with on her List Center exhibition. So I'm just going to offer some brief intros to Maria and to Cindy, and then hand it over to Cindy. Dr. Maria Walsh is a writer and art critic whose research explores spectatorship in relationship to artists' moving image practices. She is a reader in Artists Moving Image at Chelsea College of Arts and co-convenes the Subjectivity and Feminisms Research Group. Her book, Art and Psychoanalysis, 2012, investigates the surrealist engagement with psychoanalytic imagery and the contemporary use of psychoanalytic concepts to understand how meaning operates. Her most recent monograph publication, Therapeutic Aesthetics, Performative Encounters in Moving Image Artworks, investigates the screen as a critical site of therapeutic encounter. Ji Hye Kim received her BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and her MFA from Yale University School of Art. Her work has been featured in solo and group exhibitions at Helena Anrather, New York, Foxy Production, New York, François Ghebaly, Los Angeles, Interstate Projects, Brooklyn, Cooper Cole, Toronto, and Tennis Space, Shanghai Art Gallery, and the Art Gallery of York University, Toronto, as well as the Bahamas Biennale, Detroit, and many others. I've been following Cindy's work since 2016 when she was a second-year MFA student in painting at the Yale School of Art, but it wasn't until 2019 that we began a conversation around her List Center exhibition. Cindy had just closed a gallery show in New York, Verses from the Apocalypse, that impressed upon me not only how interested she was in making the technical aspects of painting conceptual, but also how she was engaging the structural confines of two-dimensional figuration to speak to psychological narratives and of confinement and frustration, using archetypal figures to connect psychodynamic power struggles to larger invisible forces of structural power and authority. Cindy's List Center exhibition extends these concerns and presents a focused selection of her recent paintings, alongside two site-responsive sculptures, a major new hanging painting, and a newly commissioned mural that features her recurring characters, Mr. Capital and Madam Earth, which I'm sure we'll hear from Cindy and Maria about later. These new works foreground an analogy between painterly support structures and bodily and psychic states of confinement, integrating organic and biological forms like plants, vines, and skeletal fragments into her allegorical compositions. Following that very long intro, and without further ado, I'll hand things over to Cindy, who will offer a brief introduction to her practice, and then Maria will join her in conversation. I should mention also that there will be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the program for a Q&A. To submit questions in this webinar style format, you may click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type your question into the pop-up text field. Bear with me for a moment while I share my screen, and we will get this underway.
Hi, thanks, Selvi. I guess I'll just wait until we can see the presentation slides.
Cindy, can you see the slides now?
Yeah, I can see the slides now.
Excellent.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. You make everything sound pretty legit. But yeah, just to give a context to the show at the List Center, I'll just talk briefly about my practice at large. So yeah, I studied illustration as an undergrad, and my illustration or my relationship to painting is, I think it's very like heavily informed by this particular training and a discipline, I guess, that views painting as an image rather than an object. And yeah, and I think this distinction is something that I'm always trying to resolve in my practice, because my introduction to painting was first and foremost understood as image making, sort of this like as a means to an end, like to convey a message or teach like some kind of a lesson or an idea, where the image like basically exists in service of or is codependent on other media. Like a good example is like a text, it accompanies a text or a sound or an animation. So as a painter, I'm just hyper aware of the fact that the painting object, in a traditional sense, like the painting just stands still and is silent. Just become too aware of that, and there's a certain indifference to it, or that I feel there's like an indifference, or like is very like disinterested in me as a viewer. Whereas like an animation or illustration, it's just trying to get your attention and trying to sort of elicit some kind of emotions out of you, in a very overt way. So yeah, I'm constantly confronted with my illustration tendencies, like my desire to like render things realistically or be decorative. And I do personally treat these tendencies as bad habits. Almost feels like my past as an illustrator haunts me where like wherever I am. So because they come in such direct conflict with um, or not conflict, but like it comes in tension with history of modernism, or as I understand it, and the kind of the idea that painting is not a window into a narrative, but it's a surface for materials. And I guess this is where I see the elements of authority within painting, and I conflate that aspect of painting and its modernist history as having a kind of parental and authorial presence to me as a maker. So very simply put, I've like willingly infantilized myself as this illustrator child with bad habits before the parental painting object. And this dynamic that I've set for myself very much becomes the subject matter in my work. And I'm sure Maria has a lot to say about that. But yeah, like the subject matter, the kind of metaphorical architecture of confinement, but as well as the theatrics of that in this image making. So I mostly approach these issues through the grisaille palette and the stretcher bars, which I find to be two hidden structures, but that are nonetheless like covertly controlling what the image is, or within the anatomy of the painting. Yeah.
Yeah, so this might be a good chance for me to come in at this point. I think that it's interesting listening to you introduce your work in this kind of dichotomy between surface and narrative, because having looked at your work online over the past few months, I'm struck by how it oscillates between what we might call form and those old bugbears of form and content, abstraction and narrative. So almost like every time I think it's a narrative, it slips into something abstract and vice versa. And content becomes form in quite a unique way. So before getting more involved in how that might be happening, I mean, it even happens with my first question I wanted to ask you about was the grisaille technique. And certainly this is what jumps out across all of your work, not just in the list exhibition, but generally. And just for our viewers, I mean, just to say a bit about that technique historically, that classical painters would use this as a form of underpainting to put color on top. So it's kind of like something hidden, or it would be used as a model for an engraver to work from, which again suggests some kind of lesser, you know, form. And it's also interesting in relation to the list exhibition is that people like Giotto and Jan van Eyck would also use it to in lieu of sculpture for lower beings in their altarpieces because it was cheaper. So on the one hand, it seems quite technical and practical, but I wonder how you came to this technique and what it means for you symbolically in your work. It's quite unique. There is this, and well, it predominates. So yeah, and I suppose symbolically, if it does relate to something to do with something, I don't know, hidden, or is it purely technical?
Yeah, I think it's both. Like just personally, like during my illustration training, yeah, it's just how I was taught how to paint. But then the glazing technique, so yeah, you set sort of the entire scene and you can use brown, or instead of black. And set the tone so that there's a harmony or the balance of the entire thing. But then when I moved into like fine art painting, the first thing that the instructor, the teachers tell you is to get rid of the black and white paint, just because they actually, yeah, like dull the color in a really awful way, like trying to make a darker color, and oftentimes like the students would use the, just put in either white or black and to make it lighter or darker, so that's like a no-no. So there's so that's kind of like my background in terms of painting with the grayscale palette. And I guess there's a symbolic aspect to it in that it is an underpainting, that exists as a hidden structure within the painting. That's what I'm mostly interested in, and using it as kind of the ghost-like presence in the painting. I don't know. There's like a very that's like there's a movie. It's like Pleasantville, like with where like the people live in like a black and white world, and then somehow they become alive with color. And there's something about like black and white world where everything's like flattened and is monotonous. And I find that to be like an interesting place to think about, like think about the anatomy of painting, or the interiority of painting, if that makes sense. Like when we look at
Yes, it certainly does. And thinking about I mean, I think we'll move towards more of the interior of painting, but I guess thinking about the exhibition at the List in particular, I think there's also, you really do seem to respond particularly to galleries, and the architectural structure of galleries seems to determine maybe not only how your work is installed, but how you might actually create new work within a space. And you've spoken before about thinking about, in relation to your exhibition at the Rodolphe Janssen Gallery in Brussels last year, you refer to thinking about the natural light in the gallery and how you wanted to create effects between that and the silk of some of the paintings. And here on the image here, we're looking at a painting which is, I believe, on silk. You can do correct me if I get the the materials wrong, because I'm actually looking at it quite small. But because light, shadow, I mean, this also relates to the grisaille. This idea of shadow is quite important. So what I wanted to ask you about, given that, is that I'm just looking at these online, as all our viewers are. Maybe some people know the List gallery space, but it looks like it's a particular kind of space. It seems to be a dark space. But so I wondered, what obstacles were there in relation to the space, or what challenges did the space provide, and particularly in relation to the mural commission, Double-Tongued Citadel, which is the backdrop to the painting that we're looking at here, which is Super Ego Fortuna, which we'll discuss later. But thinking about the commissions in particular, I think there's an interesting thing about thinking about shadow in terms of architecture within the gallery space, as well as within the actual works themselves. How did you, what mood did the gallery suggest to you for this exhibition and this commission?
Yeah, that's a really good observation, because actually in my studio, I put up like a black curtain, because
Oh, okay.
sometimes I just can't deal with natural light. It's about control or something. But yeah, I think after installing the show, and this, I don't think I was intending it uh, for the exhibition to be like all thought out, but I was thinking about like the pelvis as like a womb, like a sculpture, and thinking now like the kind of exhibition space, it is pretty intimate and small, and the ceiling and like the height of the gallery was something that I was constantly dealing with, I guess, before putting up the show, and even during install. I'm sure Selby, like, you remember like where to put things, because there's just the height of things were just too accentuated, and maybe that is sort of my it like aligns with my interest, with the kind of literally setting the boundaries of the painting surface, and yeah, like this sort of like enclosed feeling of like a confinement, and yeah, so yeah, that was I liked working in that yeah, in that context. Obviously the show at Rodolphe Janssen was different in that the window sort of provided this kind of openness to it, that yeah, that like changed how the paintings were viewed. But here, at least at the Liz Center show, yeah, the kind of architectural confinement became like a very useful tool to stage my work.
Well, it's almost like that the architectural staging is a kind of a mirror of the internal staging within the works, of this idea of confinement and surrender to authority, and structures that entrap in a way, grids, rows of lights, vines, they're all kind of structures that you can get entangled within. And I was interested, I was going to just check with you. I mean, for me, it seems like it's the pelvis is definitely, it has this very kind of female quality to it. And it's, I believe that, I mean, in this painting, it's like it is actually also practical. It's got, again, it's an image, and a very, you know, thin image in some ways, but it also acts as a support. It's both image and support for the silk. And that's kind of interesting and a different way of thinking about painting. I mean, it is certainly a kind of a staging, as well. I was also thinking about this pelvis acts as a frame for a painting, but it is also referring to a body. So there's kind of these two, it could be the painting as body, but I kind of also read it as something quite relating to a kind of psychical body in some way, an imaginary body.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, we could talk about, well, maybe we'll talk about the Superego Fortuna, which is the painting that we're looking at now. We're looking at the, well, I mean, it's ostensibly the backside in relation to what you might see if you walk into the gallery. But really, when you walk around to the back, it then becomes the front in a way. So there is this kind of oscillation. It becomes, you know, if you're looking at it from the back, it becomes the front of the painting, and the front becomes the back in a way. But I had a question about, I mean, here the title, Superego Fortuna. I believe Fortuna is a goddess figure that you've referred to in previous works. So I wanted to move maybe now towards the more narrative side of your work, which is also conceptual, but how you invent these and use these characters like the goddess Fortuna and other figures from mythology, but also particularly given that you've invited me to speak with you because of a shared interest in some psychoanalytic ideas, that the three main characters that you invent as both figurative and narrative elements of your work, Selby referred to two of them, Madame Earth and Mr. Capital, who kind of act as sentinels on either side of the mural, the double-tongued citadel. But there's also another character who seems to be absent from this exhibition, called the schoolgirl. So I guess I had a question about, is she absent, or maybe she appears somewhere else? And it's very tempting because these are three particular characters, Madame Earth, Mr. Capital, and the schoolgirl. There seems to be a kind of an allusion to an Oedipal drama. And how did you invent this as a useful structure to think through in relation to painting? Is one question. And the other is, if you could say a bit more about how has the schoolgirl been left behind, or has she transformed into something else?
Yeah, I think she appeared more in my last New York show in drawings, and I think probably there's some sort of like projection of myself in her, but she's like the kind of the figurative character in my work, and uh, like there is something like she's both the viewer and the maker of her own image, that kind of idea. And the decision to put her in a schoolgirl, like, or school uniform, was to like sort of imbue it with this position of like willing submission, or like at the position of learning, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes.
Yeah. So and and in terms of like her her relationship to her parents, I guess the mother and father, it creates to me like an it provides like a narrative structure with me with when I'm when I'm making an image. It provides some kind of like timeline to it, like the and maybe it's more allegorical in that the father figure is yeah, like I sort of refer to as like the past, and maybe, you know, it's not like I have a dictionary of like, oh, the father means that or mother means that, but the kind of there's a I think there's another drawing of like the father as like the monument, something about it,
Yeah, the
the
libido
dominant.
dominate.
um yeah, like I mean, in this sort of like the Stalin-esque figure, and the mother as like kind of like a possible future for the schoolgirl. So um yeah, like in my own uh just in the universe, like thinking about giving it like a time frame to these perfect or like a complete pictures. I think that's how I usually think about image in relation to animation, is that just given one frame, and in order for me to imbue time to it, I feel like yeah, like the parent and the child uh, yeah, sort of provides that kind of narrative structure for me. Um, and yeah, I think increasingly I've been trying to not include the schoolgirl so much in my work. Maybe like only show part of her. I'm not sure why. I think it's yeah, there's like a different. I'm trying to figure out like a different way to show that kind of like life force or something that like the figures provide, which is like I sometimes think of like working as a figurative painter. It's often too easy to use like figures because they're verbs or something, and uh, like it's yeah, I just have to like I just want to get better at trying to convey that verb in a not so literal way. So that's just something that yeah, I think I try to do, and maybe it's the vines or the veins within the paintings that I'm sort of trying to figure out. Like it serves this sort of like this decorative, like I'm like I often say this, like I'm chained to my wrist, and that like I just can't help but like render things, or maybe it's the nervousness that like soothes it. I don't know. But it sort of provides that kind of the same function as literally depicting a figure. So yeah, like and I know in the last time we talked about that orthopedic tree and the illustration. Yeah, like thinking about like my hand as this sort of like sapling tree that's being corrected by structural support. Like I think I think instead of yeah depicting like an actual human figure, there are other ways of exploring that idea of um, yeah of the hand, I guess. So yeah, that's kind of yeah.
Yes, and I mean, in fact, it's listening to you talk. I mean, you know, I'm always loath to put interpretations on an artist's work. However, because of the kind of theatrical nature of the staging as an installation, as well as all of these kinds of references and source materials, I couldn't help but think that, I mean, we just saw the previous image, I think, Female Legacy, which is an older drawing, well, from 2019. And yes, it's a very particular kind of figuration. For example, I mean, I don't know if this is the case, but I read somewhere that the distinction between for instance, the legs of the girl, which kind of relate to that tree in some ways, that they're being kind of, one of them seems to have this kind of illustrational quality that I believe has something to do with perhaps innocence. And the other one seems to almost look like one of these corrected tree trunks in some ways, that it's almost like the body has been disciplined into becoming something well, less innocent and more subservient to or oppressed, perhaps. Maybe oppressed is too strong a word, but certainly having to acknowledge more kind of disciplinary and social structures. And I was particularly intrigued by this earlier drawing because Madame Earth is in the background there. Is that, am I right? Yes.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
seems, yeah. And because I was thinking about this idea of disciplinary figures and this parental narrative, and it's interesting what you said earlier about how maybe, okay, it's not really fixed, but that perhaps Madame Earth might suggest some kind of future. And it's curious because in some psychoanalytic narratives, of course, it goes the other way around, that the female, the maternal female, would be somehow the past, and that the paternal imago signifies some kind of future. However, in a more kind of, I'm not talking about, I have to make this clear for viewers, I'm not talking about sadomasochism at all, but in a more kind of masochistic process, which I've written about in my book, Art and Psychoanalysis, and we discussed a bit last time. And this is something I do think painting is very much related to the maternal in some way, in the sense that, rather than it being considered to be something past, is something to do with an imaginary and possibilities for the future, in fact. So I find that very interesting from a psychoanalytic viewpoint. And then this is and I'll give you my projection then. So I projected from this disciplining, here the mother figure is kind of disciplining, I feel. She's observing the girl, and there's something about, I mean, also the hands are rendered in this particular way, and the book, which might relate to learning or knowledge, or be a reference even to drawing within the, this is a drawing, is it?
Yeah.
A painting. There's a kind of, referring to some kind of textuality, let's say. But what I started thinking about then was that it seemed that Madame Earth in this series seemed to me to be more disciplining than Mr. Capital, even though in the libido work that we just saw, like, he seems to be dragging, well, it's unclear. Is he dominating the schoolgirls, or are they dragging him, trying to bring him down in some way? But then I was thinking about, our question about the absence of the schoolgirl in the Liszt exhibition, and maybe she's being referred to in another way. And this is what I think, the superego Fortuna, I think this is the girl, but she's transformed into something for the future, in the sense that, I mean, I may be too literal minded here, but it is the case, is it not, that the vines and the plants, many of them are medicinal and healing kinds of plants. And I found that interesting in relation to this shift from Madame Earth being this observer of the girl to perhaps having this more universe of possibility, which might be related to the medicinal in some way. Is that too far-fetched? Have I gone too far?
No, I'm all for like the literal and saying the obvious. But yeah, I mean, I guess it was more the libido dominandi paint or drawing was more, I guess, yeah, like a more cynical in that, like, the girls were pulling it all at the same time, so it just sort of the monument stays in the same place because everyone's pulling at the same direction. That was kind of it. And then the drawing of the schoolgirl ripping the page, female legacy. I think when I'm making sort of figurative narrative work, I mean, I can like really get into it in that, like, whenever I'm making work, it's like I just imagine that, like, my mom's secretly like reading my secret diary that I only have the keys to, but I'm writing as if she's reading it, so that there's like already, it's like the diary itself is supposed to be, you know, where my purest or like unedited version of my true self is like narrating, but knowing that my mom's snooping around with her whatever, and and reading it, and but writing it so that willingly knowing that she'll be reading it, so that kind of like psychological space is, I feel like, a very productive place where I make my work. But I think I do have to preserve, I'm just talking in metaphors now, but I just need to preserve that, like there is like a chance that she's not looking at all. Like there is a pretty likely that she doesn't even have the keys to my diary, that kind of stuff.
Something I want to throw in there, as we talk about the three characters that are populating your work, Madame Earth, Mr. Capital, and the schoolgirl. And something that I've observed is these, and we're talking about figuration styles too, and the way in which Madame Earth and Mr. Capital have become increasingly abstracted. You know, you see they're often portrayed as silhouettes or flattened forms, or part of an architecture. In Double Tongue Citadel, the murals, the two-column mural on black that are frame the entire List Center exhibition, they're formed out of vines. You know, in the phenakistoscope paintings that I think we'll look at in a little bit, Cindy, that you did make in 2019, they're still kind of like very flattened figures. Here in Female Legacy, you just see Madame Earth in silhouette as compared to the way in which, you know, the schoolgirl is kind of more dimensionally rendered, and that occurs throughout the work. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think what you said about the figures becoming more decorative and becoming part of objects, I think that's that's something that I'm like very much thinking about, sort of being camouflaged into the scene more seamlessly, like, and becoming the stage themselves. And yeah, like that's like I think that creates like an interesting space for, because I don't think these characters are going to go anywhere anytime soon. So yeah, just like another way to hide them in a way, that makes their presence feel more more apparent. Yeah.
So I'm just conscious that we haven't got an awful lot of time left. So I wonder if we could quickly, I wanted to ask you about dreams, but perhaps before we go to the Oedipus to Hamlet image, perhaps as Selby has just mentioned it, we could look at the phenakistoscope works, just so that people know what we're referring to. And I believe that this is a series of 4 works, but there's only 2 in the, is that correct? And there's 2 in the exhibition.
Yeah.
I just sort of wanted to ask you about your attraction to this Victorian toy, which is an early form of an animation device to give the illusion of movement. And again, it's like you've lifted it out of movement in a way and created, there's an implied movement here, but could you maybe speak about that encounter between, you know, shifting this, your attraction to it and shifting it from movement to stillness in relation to your characters? This optical toy, for anyone that wants to know, was invented by Joseph Plateau, I believe, in 1841. So I looked this up before meeting you today, just to be sure, because it isn't something that is maybe everybody knows about. But yeah, could you say a little bit about your attraction to this as a device?
Yeah. So I mean, I talked about working as an animator, like given my background, and there's a lot of really interesting thing about, like, I mean, I'm not an optometrist and doesn't quite know about eyes, but
Mm.
the idea that human eyes can perceive movement if the images are in 10 frames per second above, but
Mhm.
anything below that, we have to read it as a still image. And something about that perceptual experience and working within like this flat kind of still image, which is painting, there's a kind of yeah, there's a kind of like a pain to that. And um yeah, it seems to accentuate, the more it tries to emulate movement, the more it seems stuck. So that's, yeah, that was sort of like my interest in the painting. And because I'm also just really attracted to like dynamism, and like we briefly talked about like looking at propaganda art, and even like biblical narratives, depictions, like the kind of the emotions that the painting can elicit. That's like what attracts to me about figuration. It's sure it has its manipulative side of trying to convey a kind of ideology, but just as like a formal tool to some like unearth something within you, I think there's like a, yeah, there's something to that that I want to explore more. And so yeah, animation device, these sort of like circular um, devices that you're meant to look into the mirror in order to see the um, movement. It had a very like, yeah, it was like a sort of beautiful form in itself that I just wanted to see if it'll, yeah, if I can sort of do an inverse of that in the painting. And yeah, that it's like important that it doesn't spin, that it just sort of sits, or it just sort of is on the wall. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they remind me of a kind of inverse. I don't know if you know Duchamp's rotary scope pieces.
Yeah.
They've got a kind of a. They remind me in some ways of them. I mean, I did want to ask you a bit about maybe your inspirations from art history, maybe as well, like surrealism. But maybe we can do that in relation to Oedipus to Hamlet the image, if that's possible. And the one, and we would, and perhaps end with this one is also Oedipus. Well, I was going to ask you something about dreams, but perhaps this can also relate to dreams, in the sense that, well, Oedipus. Oh yes, here's the earlier Oedipus to Hamlet piece, and it has a kind of surrealist. It echoes of surrealism, and one might be tempted, particularly with the title and the reference to, you know, two figures who were faced with decisions, and the idea of predetermined fates, and the idea of, you know, should one put the key in the keyhole, or is this the right key? But there's also, and that could be a quite sort of traditional way of thinking about surrealist kinds of imagery. But I also, on the other hand, the image is mysterious. And I mean, we spoke before of maybe thinking about how Freud's dream work, which the surrealists did use as a kind of ready-made. There's also another element to the dream work, which isn't to do with fixed meanings for symbols, but had a more dynamic process and more abstract poetic aspect to it. And I wonder if this is being evoked, I mean, how do you see meaning operating here? Would you want the meaning to be fixed, or is there a sense in which it does have a kind of dreamlike quality, but is it much more abstract than that, and more, more abstract?
Yeah, I think like as and apologies for the clinking noise. It's just my studio pipes. Sorry, it's like really annoying.
As long as we know, as long as we know what it is.
yeah. Yeah, like I think the two figures, Oedipus and Hamlet, just the role of fate, how that plays in the whole narrative structure of the two stories, or anti-heroes of from Western canon. I'm attracted to it in that, I mean, for Oedipus, the blindness, the theme of blindness, and the kind of fate carrying him on, and yeah, like the incest anxiety, and for Hamlet, it was the inaction and indecision that sort of, as you stated, that kind of actually propels the narrative forward. And yeah, like
there's a kind of mystery but the image itself doesn't sort of illustrate that, or does it? I mean, I think there is a kind of mystery involved in the image as well, in the way that perhaps one can't really translate exactly one's knowledge of those stories into the image. The image seems to be also acting in a different way, and perhaps that might be a good place to go to the final image of the new work, the new drawing, which is also a reference to Dream of Oedipus. And perhaps this, so there's, again, it's kind of like one moves across the surface of the image. And here, of course, we have a reference, the scale and the form of the pelvis is very, here in Superego Fortuna, we had a very large scale pelvis, which was rendered in a light kind of wood structure. But here we have a drawing of a very small pelvis, which is like center stage in some ways, spotlit. It may be too early to speak about new work, but perhaps if you wanted to think about this in relation to Dream, it might be interesting.
Yeah, I feel like my own interest in dreams, it's so narcissistic per se, just like telling people about your dreams and trying to analyze it.
Can I interrupt just for, I mean, there is narcissism, but I'd like to just quote something, one line, if I may. This psychoanalyst in the UK, Adam Phillips, I don't know if you know his work, but he said that that what the artist does is that they socialize their personal anxieties, and that they socialize it, so that even though it might stem from kind of narcissism, it doesn't remain there. And he said that, and I'll just quote this line, that artists transform things from childhood or from their personal lives into a form other people know something about. So it becomes socialized in some way. Does that resonate at all for you?
Yeah, a lot. That, like, and you also talk about that in your book, about this sort of masochistic process of art making, and that the experience is felt at a very personal place, but it's also at the same time at a distance and an impersonal. It's manifested in that. And in terms of dreams, I think again, like back to the idea of like the sort of like the interior world, somehow it's this key or the map of like what I'm, my unconscious state. But again, we know that it dreams itself is a representation. It is it's not a, that it is a fabrication. And
exactly.
Yeah, thinking about art making, it rings so true to like to that process of dream work, in that it's a simultaneous exercise, or the simultaneous activity of like revealing and concealing and revealing and concealing. Yeah, and I think
constructing, and Freud would say constructing and reconstructing.
For sure, yeah, and I think this drawing, I
think
we're so close on our hours. I'm sorry to interrupt. This is really amazing. It's going places, but I think there are also some questions from about dreams in the chat, or I mean in the Q&A rather. So I just want to, what I'm going to do is read the questions, and I'm going to read all of them out. So, and then you all can answer whatever we have time for. So Anna asks, and this does relate, what do you dream of? And would you talk a bit about how the dream relates to your process? From Tanya V, we have, and I believe these are both all addressed to Cindy. Do you feel like you are an unreliable narrator when speaking to your mother? And then from Rachel Rutherford, writes, I feel there are some uncanny elements to the work, and given your interest in psychoanalysis, do you feel that is something you consider in your work or something that you're interested in? And then I have one also from Virginia Lee Montgomery. Hi, Virginia. Cindy, I love how you said you use figures in your art like verbs. Do you choose symmetrical visual devices to stage action too? Did I read too many out at once?
I'll try my best. Okay, what do I dream of? Just everything and nothing, I guess. In that they seem to be very narrative based, like something, it's propelled by like actions and not quite photographic at all, really. Yeah, dream, and it seems to like mix, like it's very interesting mix of things that arrangements that I wouldn't be able to make in my waking life. So instead of trying to actually, like, I'll have dreams about, make like whatever, just anything, and actually try to write it out and make sense of it. It often fails because it doesn't work. But what I can try to get it out of the dream is the general mood of things, and how the sort of like unfamiliar things become familiar. Like that aspect of dream work is like very powerful. Yeah, just kind of the kind of access of arrangements that I just can't have in my like day-to-day waking life, but it sort of like opens it up. So yeah, I try to like use that in my images, but oftentimes it's like I'm really excited in the morning. I'm like, oh shit, like that was like a really fun thing, but then quickly realize it's like, it's actually, when I try to like make it into art, it's like 9 out of 10 times it's quite like banal and not that interesting. So so that's my sort of process. And do I feel like you're an unreliable narrator when speaking to your mother? Yeah, because like it's like a role play or something, like I'm the mother and let's see what I'll say, and yeah, that kind of stuff. And Maria, like, please feel free to jump in. I'm just going over these answers or questions. The uncanny elements, actually, Maria, in your book you say that it's actually it translates to unhomely.
Yes, it's both homely and unhomely in the same term, which I think is a useful way of thinking about how in art there can be this kind of simultaneity between opposites. And of course, the uncanny is very much related to a maternal space, however one wants to think about that space. It'll be different depending on what one's intentions are. But I guess for me, that question, if I relates a bit to the kind of maybe Madame Earth, the figure of Madame Earth, and what you were saying about the mother, something both maybe internalized like a superego, but at the same time, something related to future possibility. There is this, and this for me would be an uncanny element in the sense that it's a kind of oscillation between opposites. Yeah, Freud's Heimlich on Heimlich. So Heimlich in German is translated into homely, unhomely in English. It doesn't have the same resonance, but it's the best translation. But it does relate to the mother. For Freud, the mother's body, of course, in the Oedipal narrative is uncanny. This is a problematic thing to say, but yeah, I think it could be developed further in thinking about your work for sure.
Yeah.
I wonder if, sorry to interrupt, I was just going, yeah. I just thought it might be interesting, I'd love to know as well, Cindy, how this relation between the verbs, how you choose symmetrical visual devices to stage action too. Something about using figures like verbs is quite interesting. I'm not sure I understand the question, but it seemed to resonate.
Yeah, maybe like symmetrical devices are like ways for me to like make bad rhymes, like making things echo, and give it like a formal integrity to things. Maybe that's my impulse. I think I have my own sort of anxiety and criticality towards my use of like symmetry. It's sometimes like maddening to see it, like that impulse to make things like the perfect image of the other, to repeat things the same so that there's a seamlessness to it. So in that, yeah, there's always yeah, like a tension there, and trying not to wanting to be symmetrical, wanting to mirror things, but it's always not quite the same. And I don't know how much time we have, but I had a quote pulled up from your book, the Uncanny chapter, where you describe uncanny as the act of concealment. What is hidden and secret is also threatening and fearful, occult, and the name for everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden but has come to light, bringing anxiety in its train. That's like such a productive, to me, it's like a very productive way of looking at trying to yeah, look at the interiority of things. So I think it's, yeah, for making images.
And
yeah,
I'm glad we got the repetition in as well, because that was something I wanted to ask you about. So it's good that the question about symmetry, also the idea of things being the same maybe, but different and having to be done all over again in some kind of attempt to make this, did you say perfect image?
Yeah. I think. And who was the quote from about artists? Maybe it was, this is for Maria. But
oh, Adam
that was one.
Is there?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm looking at the questions as well.
But I think
oh,
that
yeah,
that's concluded all of the questions, and I kind of love this note of ending on this kind of repetition. I think it's a good funny theme to end on. So I think everyone who attended, Cindy, Maria, I thank you both for your time and for this fascinating conversation around Cindy's work, and a lot of the psychoanalytic ideas that I just don't have a reference point for. So thank you for bringing that expertise to the List Center's programming, Maria.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cindy, for your work
And,
as well.
thank
Lots to
you.
think about.
Yeah, lots to dream about. Yeah.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.